The mountain air cut thin and sharp at 12,000 feet, carrying with it the bite of snow that never fully melted and the metallic tang of equipment that had seen too many winters. Pine needles crunched underfoot on the narrow trail that wound between granite outcroppings, their sound muffled by the dense canopy overhead that filtered the morning light into scattered pools of gold and shadow. The scent of pine resin mixed with the cleaner smell of high altitude, where the air itself seemed scrubbed clean by wind and weather. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lenny Crawford moved along the trail with a stride that covered ground efficiently despite her compact frame. At 5 feet 2 inches, she had learned long ago that economy of movement mattered more than length of leg. Her boots, worn but well-maintained, found purchase on the rocky path with the confidence of someone who had walked these mountains for years. The canvas pack on her shoulders rode steady and balanced, its weight distributed with the kind of precision that spoke of experience rather than accident. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid that disappeared beneath the collar of her field jacket, the practical style chosen for function rather than appearance. The jacket itself was a regulation issue, but the way she wore it suggested someone who understood the difference between following rules and following wisdom. The fabric showed the creases and faint stains of genuine use, marks earned through months of training exercises that pushed equipment to its limits. The trail ahead curved around a massive boulder that time and weather had carved into something resembling abstract art. Lenny paused at its base, not from fatigue but from habit, using the moment to scan the terrain ahead and listen to the mountain's subtle sounds. The whisper of wind through pine branches carried no unusual notes. The distant cry of a hawk spoke of undisturbed wildlife. The creak and groan of trees adjusting to the morning's warming air followed patterns she had learned to read like text. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small compass, its brass case polished smooth by handling. The needle swung and settled, confirming what she already knew about direction, but checking anyway because in the mountains, assumption could kill as surely as exposure. The bearing matched her mental map, placing her exactly where she intended to be on her route she had planned the night before with the kind of thoroughness that left nothing to chance. The trail descended gradually toward the valley floor, where Camp Redstone sprawled across several acres of cleared forest like a carefully organized scar on the landscape. From her vantage point, Lenny could see the geometric patterns of temporary buildings, training areas and vehicle parks that made up the specialized combat training facility. Smoke rose from the mess hall chimney, a thin gray line against the pale morning sky. The distant sound of engines warming up carried on the air, mixing with the sharper notes of commands being called across the parade ground. Camp Redstone existed for one purpose: to prepare elite soldiers for operations in hostile territory where conventional warfare gave way to something more personal, more brutal, and infinitely more dangerous. It was here that the military's best learned to fight, not just with weapons and technology, but with hands and mind, and the kind of controlled violence that required both physical skill and psychological steel. Lenny had arrived 3 weeks ago as part of the latest training cycle, one of 43 soldiers selected from units across the country for specialized close-quarters combat instruction. The selection process had been rigorous enough to weed out all but the most capable, but capability took many forms, and not all of them were immediately obvious to the casual observer. She resumed her descent, boots finding their rhythm on the switchbacking trail that carved its way down the mountainside in a series of controlled falls. The pack's weight shifted slightly with each step, but never enough to throw off her balance. Years of carrying heavy loads over difficult terrain had taught her body to adapt, to find its center of gravity and maintain it regardless of external pressures. The morning routine that had brought her to this trail had begun before dawn. As It did every day. While others in her unit slept, Lenny had risen in the pre-dawn darkness and prepared for a solo reconnaissance exercise that was officially optional, but which she treated as essential. The instructors encouraged such self-directed training, recognizing that soldiers who pushed themselves beyond minimum requirements often performed better when circumstances demanded extra effort. Her quarters in the women's barracks were Spartan, even by military standards. A narrow bunk with regulation bedding, a small metal locker for personal items, and a wooden desk that had seen decades of use by previous occupants. Lenny had added nothing decorative, no photographs or mementos that might suggest softness or distraction. The space reflected its occupant, functional, efficient, and focused on purpose rather than comfort. The other women in her unit had initially tried to include her in the informal social networks that formed naturally among soldiers thrown together in unfamiliar circumstances. Invitations to join card games in the common room, suggestions to share meals at tables where conversation flowed freely, attempts to draw her into the kind of casual banter that helped pass time and build camaraderie. Lenny had responded politely, but briefly, her participation measured and her contributions minimal. It was not that she disliked her fellow soldiers or considered herself superior to their company. Rather, she had learned that being underestimated was often more valuable than being understood. The assumptions others made about her based on size, gender, and her tendency toward quiet observation created opportunities that more obvious displays of competence would have closed. In a world where first impressions carried lasting weight, she had chosen to make hers deliberately forgettable. The trail leveled out as it approached the valley floor, the gradient easing into something that felt almost flat after the steep descent from the ridge. Lenny could smell the camp now, the mixture of diesel fuel, cooking food, and the particular odor of canvas and leather that clung to any place where soldiers gathered. The sounds were clearer too, engines, voices, the metallic clatter of equipment being moved and arranged. She paused again at the edge of the cleared area that surrounded the camp, using the last moments of solitude to center herself for the day. Ahead, the morning reconnaissance had served multiple purposes beyond simple physical conditioning. It had allowed her to study the terrain from angles not covered in the standard briefings, to identify potential routes and hiding places that might prove useful in future exercises. More importantly, it had given her time to think without the distractions of group dynamics and institutional expectations. Camp Redstone operated on a philosophy that stressed adaptation and improvisation. Soldiers were expected to master not just specific techniques, but the principles underlying effective combat. The curriculum included traditional martial arts, modern combatives, weapons training, and psychological preparation for the kind of close-quarters fighting where hesitation meant death and creativity often determined survival. Lenny had excelled in the technical aspects of the training, but her instructors seemed puzzled by her approach. She absorbed information like a sponge, demonstrating techniques with precision and consistency, but she did so without the aggressive energy they expected from elite soldiers. Her sparring sessions were clinically effective, but somehow unsatisfying to watch, as if she were holding something back that her partners could sense but not identify. The truth was that Lenny understood violence in ways that went beyond what could be taught in any formal curriculum. She had grown up in circumstances that required her to learn self-protection as a survival skill, rather than a professional requirement. The techniques being taught at Camp Redstone were refinements of knowledge she had acquired through necessity, improvements on foundations laid during a childhood that had demanded early maturity and constant vigilance. Her father had been a career soldier who brought military discipline home, but struggled to leave military problems in the field. Her mother had been a woman who loved unwisely and stayed too long in situations that required leaving. Between them, they had created a household where Lenny learned that size mattered less than timing, that strength could be overcome by leverage, and that the willingness to do what others would not often determine who walked away. Those lessons had been reinforced during her early military service, where being small and female in predominantly male units had presented challenges that regulations could not address. She had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of military life, to earn respect without appearing to seek it, and to demonstrate capability in ways that did not threaten the egos of those who might otherwise become obstacles to her. Advancement. The morning sun had risen high enough to clear the eastern ridge, sending long shafts of light across the valley that illuminated the camp in stark detail. Lenny could see soldiers moving between buildings, their movements purposeful in the way that suggested scheduled activities rather than casual wandering. The day's training would begin soon, and her absence from the morning formation would have been noted, if not officially recorded. She began walking across the open ground toward the camp perimeter, her pace steady but unhurried. The transition from wilderness to military installation was marked by subtle changes, the ground more level and cleared of debris, the vegetation trimmed back to regulation distances, the appearance of posted signs that designated areas and warned of restrictions. The organization was typical of temporary military facilities, efficient but impermanent, designed to be effective while it lasted, but leaving minimal trace. When it was time to move on, the guard post at the camp entrance was manned by 2 soldiers who watched her approach with professional interest but no apparent concern. They recognized her, of course, as they recognized all the trainees who belonged to the current cycle. The morning reconnaissance exercise was common enough that her return from the mountains required no explanation or special clearance. She nodded to them as she passed, receiving acknowledgement, but no greeting. The interaction as economical as everything else about military life. Inside the perimeter, Camp Redstone revealed itself as a carefully planned arrangement of function and efficiency. The buildings were modular structures that could be assembled, disassembled, and transported as operational requirements changed. The training areas were marked by worn ground and the particular scars that came from repeated practice with weapons and tactics. Everything had the temporary but serious quality of a place, designed to prepare people for permanent consequences. Lenny made her way toward the barracks, passing clusters of soldiers who were already engaged in morning preparations. Some were cleaning weapons, others were reviewing training schedules, and a few were simply sitting quietly with the kind of internal focus that suggested mental preparation for challenges ahead. She drew glances but not attention. Her presence registered but not remarked upon. The barracks smelled of canvas, metal, and the faint residue of cleaning products that never quite eliminated the human odors of a space where many people lived. In close quarters, Lenny's footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor as she made her way to her assigned area. Her bunk remained exactly as she had left it, bedding tight and regulation perfect, personal items secured in the metal locker that contained everything she owned at Camp Redstone. She began the process of preparing for the day's scheduled training, movements economically and practiced. The mountain reconnaissance had been preparation in one sense, but now came the preparation for performance under observation. Every action would be watched, evaluated, and recorded by instructors whose job was to identify strengths and weaknesses in soldiers who had already proven themselves capable enough to reach this level of training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning light streaming through the barracks windows carried with it the promise of heat that would build throughout the day. The mountains offered cool mornings and hot afternoons, conditions that added their own challenges to training exercises designed to test limits. Lenny had learned to appreciate such challenges, to find in them opportunities to demonstrate the kind of resilience that could not be taught but only revealed through testing. Around her, the barracks filled with the sounds of other soldiers, beginning their own preparations. Conversations were brief and focused, The casual banter limited by awareness that the day ahead would demand serious attention. Camp Redstone had a way of imposing its own rhythm on those who passed through it, a tempo that acknowledged both the importance of the training and the reality that not everyone would complete it successfully. Lenny completed her preparations and stood for a moment in the growing light, mentally reviewing the day's scheduled activities and her approach to each. The morning reconnaissance had served its purpose, providing both physical conditioning and the kind of mental clarity that came from solitude and movement. Now came the test of applying that clarity to the challenges that others would witness and judge. The mountain air still clung to her uniform, carrying with it the memory of pine and granite and the vast spaces where problems were simpler and solutions more direct. Soon enough, she would be immersed again in the complex dynamics of group training, where individual capability intersected with institutional expectations and personal interactions. The transition required its own kind of mental shifting, from the clarity of solitude to the complexity of performance under observation. But for now, in the brief space between preparation and action, Lenny stood quiet and centered, ready for whatever the day might demand. The mess hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of 43 soldiers consuming breakfast with military efficiency. Steam rose from metal serving trays filled with scrambled eggs, bacon, and hash browns that had been prepared in quantities designed to fuel bodies that would spend the day pushing physical limits. The smell of coffee dominated the air, strong and bitter in the way that military coffee always seemed to be, as if weakness had been deliberately brewed out of it. Lenny moved through the serving line with the same measured pace she brought to everything else, except in portions that were adequate without being excessive. The mess hall workers, civilian contractors who had seen hundreds of soldiers pass through Camp Redstone, served each trainee with practiced indifference. To them, one soldier looked much like another, distinguished only by appetite and politeness. Lenny thanked the servers quietly and carried her tray toward the section where her training unit typically gathered. The tables were long and narrow, designed to accommodate maximum seating in minimum space. They were built from heavy wood that had been scarred by years of use, marked with the inevitable nicks and scratches that came from metal trays and utensils repeatedly striking their surface. The benches were equally functional, providing seating without comfort, encouraging soldiers to eat efficiently and move on to more important activities. Sergeant Marcus Hendricks dominated the center of the largest table, his massive frame requiring more space than the bench typically provided for two soldiers. At 6 feet 4 inches and easily 260 pounds, he possessed the kind of physical presence that commanded attention without effort. His voice carried across the mess hall even when he spoke at normal volume, a deep bass that seemed to resonate from somewhere in his chest. Everything about him suggested strength applied without subtlety. "Morning, Tiny," Hendricks called out as Lenny approached with her tray, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby tables could hear. "Hope you got your beauty sleep. Today's going to separate the real soldiers from the ... well, whatever it is you're supposed to be." The comment drew chuckles from several soldiers seated near Hendricks, the kind of automatic laughter that greeted any joke from someone whose size and rank made disagreement inadvisable. Corporal Jake Morrison, a compact man whose muscle mass seemed to have been compressed into his 5'8" frame, grinned openly at the remark. Private First Class Tommy Watson, lanky and eager to fit in with the group's dominant personalities, added his own laugh even though the humor escaped him. Lenny took a seat at the far end of the table, placing her tray carefully on the scarred wood surface. She began eating with the same methodical approach she brought to other tasks, cutting her food into manageable pieces and consuming it without apparent hurry. Her expression remained neutral, giving no indication that she had heard Hendricks' comment or the laughter it had generated. "You know what I heard?" Morrison leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to create the illusion of confidentiality, while ensuring his words carried to the intended audience. I heard they're thinking about creating a separate training track for soldiers who can't meet the physical standards. Something more appropriate for people who look like they belong. In an office instead of a combat zone. Watson nodded eagerly, always ready to support any observation that might raise his standing with the group's alpha personalities. Makes sense to me. I mean, no offense to anyone, but when you're depending on someone to watch your back in a firefight, you want to know they can actually handle themselves. The conversation continued around Lenny as if she were not present, each participant adding observations that built on the central theme of her unsuitability for elite military training. The comments were not technically abusive, staying just within the boundaries of what might be considered professional banter between soldiers. But their cumulative effect was to establish and reinforce a hierarchy that placed her firmly at the bottom. Staff Sergeant Nicole Barnes, one of 3 women in the training unit, sat 2 tables away with a group that included both male and female soldiers. She had been at Camp Redstone for the full 3 weeks and had established herself as someone who belonged through aggressive participation in every activity and vocal confidence in her own abilities. Her voice carried a slight southern accent that became more pronounced when she was making a point. Some people just aren't cut out for this level of training, Barnes observed, ostensibly speaking to her table mates, but projecting her voice enough to ensure broader coverage. It's not about gender, it's about capability. But when someone's trying to prove something they don't actually possess, it puts everyone else at risk. The comment was carefully constructed to appear supportive of women in general while specifically targeting one woman in particular. Barnes had learned to navigate military politics by positioning herself as one of the exceptional females who deserved to be included rather than one of the problematic ones who undermined the case for broader inclusion. It was a strategy that required constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice of potential allies. Hendricks seized on Barnes' comment like a predator recognizing opportunity. Exactly right, Sergeant. This isn't about giving everyone a participation trophy. This is about identifying soldiers who can handle real combat situations. When bullets start flying, nobody cares about your feelings or whether the training was fair. They care about whether you can do the job. The mess hall's background noise provided a constant undertone to the conversation. The clatter of utensils against metal trays, the scrape of benches being moved, the low murmur of dozens of other conversations happening simultaneously. But within the bubble of attention that surrounded Hendrick's table, every word carried weight and meaning beyond its surface content. Lenny continued eating, her movements steady and unhurried, despite the growing focus of attention on her presence. She cut a piece of bacon into smaller segments, chewed thoroughly, and swallowed before moving on to the next bite. Her apparent obliviousness to the conversation happening around her only seemed to encourage its continuation. "I'm just saying," Morrison added, his confidence growing with each supportive nod from his peers. "If someone can't handle a little friendly conversation, how are they going to handle actual pressure? Combat doesn't come with safe spaces." The laughter that followed was louder this time, more pointed in its direction and more confident in its cruelty. Several soldiers from other tables had begun paying attention to the exchange, drawn by the combination of group dynamics and the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. The mess hall's social ecosystem was beginning to organize itself around the emerging spectacle. Lieutenant David Cross, the ranking officer present in the mess hall, sat at a table near the serving line with 2 other officers. At 32, he possessed the kind of lean build that suggested endurance rather than raw power, and his manner combined professional competence with the easy confidence of someone who had proven himself in multiple contexts. He had been observing the interaction at Hendrick's table with growing disapproval, but military protocol complicated any intervention he might consider. The training at Camp Redstone operated under a philosophy that encouraged soldiers to work out interpersonal conflicts independently. Officers were expected to intervene only when situations escalated beyond the boundaries of professional behavior or threatened to compromise training objectives. The line between acceptable military banter and problematic harassment was often subjective, determined more by context and consequences than by specific words or actions. Of course, Hendricks continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering wisdom rather than opinion. There's always the possibility that someone might surprise us. Maybe our little friend here has some hidden talents we haven't discovered yet. Maybe she's secretly a martial arts expert or something. The suggestion was delivered with the kind of exaggerated sincerity that made its sarcasm unmistakable. Several soldiers laughed outright at the idea, the mental image of Lenny as a combat expert apparently striking them as inherently ridiculous. The laughter was cruel but not vicious, born more from incredulity than malice. Watson, emboldened by the group's receptiveness to his contributions, decided to add his own flourish to the theme. Yeah, maybe she's like one of those movie characters who looks harmless, but then does backflips and takes out a room full of bad guys. What do they call that? Hidden Dragon or something? The reference to martial arts films drew more laughter, the cultural stereotype providing a convenient framework for the group's amusement. The idea that someone of Lenny's size and apparent demeanor might possess extraordinary fighting skills was treated as inherently comedic, a fantasy suitable for entertainment, but absurd when applied to real military training. Barnes joined the laughter but added her own qualification. Nothing wrong with martial arts, of course. Great exercise builds discipline, teaches respect. But there's a big difference between doing forms in a nice clean dojo and handling yourself in actual combat. Real fighting is messy and brutal, and it usually comes down to who's bigger and stronger and more willing to do whatever it takes to win. The observation carried the weight of apparent expertise, though Barnes' actual combat experience was limited to training exercises and brief deployments in relatively secure areas. Like many soldiers, she had developed strong opinions about combat effectiveness, based more on theory and cultural assumptions than direct experience. Her confidence in those opinions was unshaken by their speculative nature. Lenny finished her breakfast and began gathering her utensils on the tray, preparing to clear her place and move on to the day's scheduled activities. Her movements remained calm and methodical, showing no signs of hurry or distress despite the continued attention focused on her table. She stood, lifted the tray, and walked toward the dish return area with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the meal. There she goes, Morrison observed, as if commenting on some natural phenomenon rather than a fellow soldier. Off to prepare for another day of trying to keep up with people who actually belong here. The comment drew final chuckles from the group as Lenny disappeared from their immediate attention. But the conversation had served its purpose, establishing social dynamics that would influence interactions throughout the training cycle. Lines had been drawn, hierarchies reinforced, and expectations set for how the group would function in more challenging circumstances. Lieutenant Cross finished his own breakfast and approached Hendricks' table as the soldiers prepared to leave for the morning's training activities. His presence caused an immediate shift in the group's demeanor, casual confidence replaced by the formal respect required when addressing a superior officer. "Sergeant Hendricks," Cross said, his tone professional but carrying an undertone that suggested careful attention to what followed. "I trust you understand that unit cohesion is essential to successful completion of this training cycle. Every soldier here has earned their place through demonstrated competence, and every soldier deserves the opportunity to prove themselves without unnecessary distractions." Hendricks straightened slightly, his expression shifting to match the formal tenor of the interaction. "Absolutely, sir. Just encouraging team building and unit solidarity. Nothing more than standard military banter." Cross nodded once, acknowledging the response without necessarily accepting it. "I'm sure that's true, Sergeant." I'm also sure you'll ensure that all your interactions continue to support our training objectives rather than undermining them." The exchange was brief and polite, but its implications were clear to everyone within hearing distance. Cross had drawn a line without explicitly forbidding specific behavior, leaving Hendricks with enough latitude to maintain dignity while making clear that continued observation would follow. It was the kind of leadership intervention that addressed problems without creating larger conflicts. As the mess hall began to empty, soldiers clearing their tables and moving toward training areas, the morning's social dynamics had been established. Groups had formed around shared assumptions and mutual interests. Alliances had been suggested if not formalized, and at least one soldier had been designated as existing outside the protective boundaries of group membership. The morning air outside the mess hall carried the crisp bite of high altitude and the promise of heat that would build throughout the day. Soldiers moved in loose formations toward various training areas, their conversations shifting from social matters to professional concerns. The day's curriculum would test different capabilities than those demonstrated over breakfast, but the social foundation laid during the meal would influence every subsequent interaction. Lenny walked alone toward the combat training facility, her pace steady and her expression unchanged from what it had been throughout breakfast. The morning's conversation had provided valuable information about group dynamics and individual personalities that would be useful in future interactions. She had learned who led, who followed, who thought independently, and who simply echoed the opinions of others. More importantly, she had learned that her strategy of appearing unremarkable was working exactly as intended. The assumptions others made about her capabilities, based on size and demeanor, created opportunities that more obvious displays of competence would have eliminated. Being underestimated was not comfortable, but it was useful. The combat training facility loomed ahead, a large building that contained mats, equipment, and space for the kind of close-quarters instruction that would define the day's activities. Inside, soldiers would test themselves against each other in controlled scenarios, designed to reveal strengths and weaknesses that could mean the difference between success and failure in real combat situations. Lenny approached the building with the same measured confidence she brought to everything else, ready to demonstrate capabilities that might surprise those who had dismissed her based on appearances. The morning's mockery had established expectations that would make the day's revelations all the more striking when they came. The combat training facility's interior opened into a vast space dominated by thick blue mats that covered nearly every square foot of flooring. Overhead, industrial lighting cast harsh shadows that eliminated any possibility of visual refuge, while ventilation fans churned the air with a steady mechanical rhythm that would soon be overwhelmed by the sounds of physical exertion. The walls were lined with equipment racks holding protective gear, training weapons, and medical supplies arranged with the kind of obsessive organization that suggested serious consequences for disorder. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of the space, her presence commanding attention without requiring voice or gesture. At 41, she possessed the lean musculature of someone who had spent decades maintaining peak physical condition, and her movements carried the fluid precision that came from years of studying and teaching combatives. Her dark eyes swept the assembled soldiers with the clinical assessment of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Today marks your transition from theoretical knowledge to practical application, Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying easily across the large space despite its conversational volume. You have spent 3 weeks learning techniques, studying principles, and developing muscle memory. Now you will discover whether that preparation translates into effective performance. Under pressure. The 43 soldiers arranged themselves in loose formation facing Rodriguez, their attention focused with the kind of intensity that recognized the importance of first impressions in any new phase of training. Among them, subtle groupings reflected the social dynamics that had been developing since their arrival at Camp Redstone. Hendrik stood near the center with his usual collection of followers, while other soldiers had clustered around different focal points of influence and expertise. Lenny positioned herself toward the back of the formation, not from any desire to avoid attention, but because the location offered better sight lines for observing both the instructor and her fellow trainees. The morning's breakfast conversation had provided valuable intelligence about group hierarchies and individual personalities, but actual combat training would reveal capabilities that social interaction could only hint at. Combat, Rodriguez continued, beginning to pace in a pattern that took her past different sections of the formation, is not a democratic process. It does not care about your rank, your background, your confidence, or your assumptions about yourself and others. Combat cares only about what you can actually do when everything familiar becomes chaotic and every decision carries consequences you cannot undo. The instructor's words carried the weight of experience earned in places where theory met reality with violent results. Rodriguez had served 3 combat deployments in environments where close quarters fighting was not an academic exercise, but a survival skill that determined who returned home and who did not. Her approach to training reflected that experience, emphasizing practical effectiveness over theoretical perfection. "You will be divided into groups of 8, she announced, producing a clipboard that contained assignments based on careful observation of each soldier's strengths, weaknesses, and personality traits. Each group will rotate through different scenarios designed to test specific aspects of combative effectiveness. Your performance will be evaluated not just on technical execution, but on adaptability, decision-making under pressure, and ability to function as part of a team." The group assignments were read aloud, names called in combinations that had been calculated to create productive friction rather than comfortable familiarity. Rodriguez understood that soldiers who trained only with similar partners developed limited skill sets, while those who faced diverse challenges grew more adaptable and resilient. The pairings mixed experience levels, physical attributes, and personality types in ways designed to force growth through controlled adversity. Lenny found herself assigned to Group C along with 7 other soldiers whose selection appeared random, but almost certainly was not. Hendricks was not among them, having been placed with a different collection of dominant personalities who would challenge his assumptions about leadership through confrontation rather than subordination. The assignment suggested that Rodriguez understood more about individual dynamics than casual observation might reveal. Group C gathered around Station 3, where Senior Instructor Staff Sergeant Michael Chun waited with the kind of patient attention that suggested deep familiarity with the training process. Chun possessed the compact build and flowing movement patterns of someone whose martial arts background went beyond military requirements into personal passion. His presence suggested technical expertise rather than raw physical dominance. Station 3 focuses on situational awareness and threat assessment, Chun explained as the 8 soldiers arranged themselves in a semicircle around him. You will enter scenarios where the nature and location of threats are not immediately obvious. Success depends on your ability to read environmental cues, assess multiple variables simultaneously, and respond appropriately to developing situations. The first scenario involved a mock urban environment, constructed from modular walls and furniture that could be reconfigured to simulate different tactical situations. Chun led the group through the space, pointing out details that might indicate hidden dangers, furniture positioning that could conceal weapons or personnel, lighting patterns that created blind spots, sound signatures that might mask approaching threat assessment, Chun continued, begins with understanding that appearances can be deliberately misleading. An enemy who wants to kill you will not necessarily look like what you expect an enemy to look like. They will use your assumptions against you, exploiting psychological and cultural biases that cause you to focus attention on obvious threats while missing subtle but deadly ones. The observation carried particular relevance for soldiers whose training had emphasized conventional combat scenarios. where enemies were clearly identified and threats followed predictable patterns. But modern conflict increasingly involved situations where distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants required split-second decisions based on incomplete information, where mistakes could prove fatal for both soldiers and civilians. As Group C moved through the scenario, each soldier's approach to threat assessment revealed different strengths and limitations. Some focused intently on obvious tactical considerations like cover and concealment, while others paid more attention to human behavioral cues that might indicate hostile intent. The diversity of approaches created learning opportunities as team members observed and learned from each other's perspectives. Lenny's performance during the scenario was methodical and thorough, her attention moving systematically through the environment in patterns that suggested formal training in surveillance and reconnaissance. She identified threats that others missed while avoiding the fixation on obvious dangers that caused some team members to overlook subtle indicators. Her movements were economical and precise, wasting no energy on unnecessary actions. Interesting approach, Chun observed quietly as the group completed their first rotation through the scenario. Some of you are thinking like soldiers, others like police officers, and a few like someone else entirely. Each perspective has value, but the most effective approach integrates multiple viewpoints rather than relying on a single framework. The second scenario introduced physical threat assessment, requiring soldiers to evaluate potential opponents based on body language, positioning, and behavioral cues rather than obvious weapons or uniforms. Chun had recruited several instructors to play various roles, from obviously hostile to apparently neutral, challenging the trainees to distinguish between actual threats and misdirection. Size and physical appearance, Chun noted as the group prepared for the exercise, are among the least reliable indicators of actual combat effectiveness. Some of the most dangerous people I have encountered looked like they belonged in an accounting office rather than a battlefield. Conversely, some of the most impressive physical specimens proved surprisingly ineffective when faced with opponents who understood leverage, timing, and anatomical vulnerability. The scenario unfolded in a controlled environment designed to soon simulate the kind of ambiguous situation soldiers might encounter in occupied territory or during peacekeeping operations. Multiple role players moved through the space with different objectives and threat levels, requiring the trainees to make rapid assessments based on behavioral observation rather than obvious indicators. Hendrick's group was rotating through a different station, but his voice carried across the training facility as he engaged in what appeared to be animated discussion with his instructor. The conversation specifics were unclear, but its tone suggested disagreement about methods or results. Several soldiers from other groups glanced in that direction, their attention briefly diverted from their own training. At Station 3, Lenny's performance continued to distinguish itself through careful observation and precise response. She identified threats that others missed while avoiding false positives that might have led to inappropriate actions. Her assessment of role players was based on subtle cues, posture, hand positioning, eye movement patterns that indicated training or intent rather than obvious physical characteristics. Excellent threat discrimination, Chun commented after the second scenario concluded. Someone has been paying attention to details that matter more than details that simply draw attention. The third rotation introduced the element that would transform the day from training exercise to something more consequential. Chun gathered Group C around a table displaying photographs and documents that appeared to be intelligence briefings rather than training materials. The images showed faces, locations, and equipment with the kind of detail that suggested real-world significance rather than academic exercise. Advanced threat assessment, Chun announced, his tone carrying a new level of seriousness, requires understanding that some scenarios you encounter during training may have applications beyond this facility. The skills you develop here could Be called upon in situations where the stakes are considerably higher than grades or advancement. The photograph showed several individuals whose faces combined familiar features with subtle differences that suggested careful observation would be required to distinguish between them and similar-looking people. One image in particular stood out, a man whose massive frame and distinctive facial features made him immediately memorable despite the poor quality of the surveillance photograph from which the image had been taken. This individual, Chun continued, indicating the photograph of the large man, represents a specific type of threat you may encounter in operational environments. Physical intimidation is his primary tool, supported by tactical training that emphasizes overwhelming force rather than technical sophistication. He relies on psychological dominance to control situations before physical confrontation becomes necessary. The photograph showed someone whose size and bearing suggested the kind of natural physical advantages that could be decisive in close quarters combat. His posture indicated confidence bordering on arrogance, the stance of someone who had rarely encountered opponents, capable of challenging his dominance through conventional means. Lenny studied the photograph with the same methodical attention she had brought to other aspects of the training, but something in her expression suggested recognition beyond simple academic interest. The image stirred memories of previous encounters with similar personalities, situations where size and intimidation had been weapons deployed against those considered easy targets. Intelligence reports, Chun continued, indicate that this individual may be operating in sectors where our personnel could encounter him during future deployments. His presence would represent a significant tactical challenge for conventional approaches to threat neutralization. Standard protocols might prove inadequate when dealing with someone who combines unusual physical capabilities with tactical training and operational experience. The briefing continued with technical details about the individual's background, training, and operational methods. But for Lenny, the information confirmed suspicions that had been building throughout the morning. The transition from training exercise to operational briefing suggested that Camp Redstone served purposes beyond simple skill development. Some trainees were being prepared for specific missions that would require capabilities beyond conventional military training. The revelation added new dimensions to the social dynamics that had been developing among the training group. What had appeared to be simple personality conflicts and competitive positioning now carried implications for actual operational assignments. Success or failure during training could determine not just advancement opportunities, but survival in environments where second chances were rarely available. As Group C completed their rotation through Station 3, the morning's training had revealed capabilities and limitations that would influence all subsequent interactions. Some soldiers had demonstrated technical competence, but lacked the psychological flexibility required for ambiguous situations. Others showed good instincts, but needed refinement and execution. A few had displayed unexpected depths that suggested their initial assessments might require revision. The rotation schedule moved groups through different stations, each designed to test specific aspects of combative effectiveness. By midday, every soldier would have been evaluated across multiple scenarios, their performance documented for analysis and future assignment decisions. The democratic appearance of equal training opportunities masked a selection process that would determine which soldiers received advanced instruction and which returned to conventional units. Lenny moved with her group towards Station 4, where new challenges waited to test different aspects of combat readiness. The morning's scenarios had confirmed her assessment that appearances often concealed realities, that assumptions based on surface observations frequently proved dangerous, and that the most effective opponents were often those who looked least threatening. The training facility buzzed with controlled energy as soldiers engaged with scenarios designed to push their capabilities and reveal their limitations. The sound of instruction mixed with physical exertion, creating an atmosphere of focused intensity that would build throughout the day. But beneath the surface of routine training, larger forces were preparing to test the soldiers in ways that no exercise could fully simulate. The photograph Chun had shown continued to resonate in Lenny's memory, not as an abstract threat, but as a specific challenge that would require precise preparation and flawless execution to overcome. The morning's mockery had established expectations about her, capabilities that might prove advantageous when facing an opponent who relied on psychological intimidation and physical dominance, rather than technical skill and tactical intelligence. Station 4 awaited, with new tests and revelations that would move the day closer to its inevitable climax. Station 4 occupied a separate wing of the training facility, where thick concrete walls muffled sound and industrial-grade air filtration systems maintained precise environmental conditions. The space felt different from the open training areas, more clinical and controlled, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested activities requiring absolute precision. Overhead lighting had been adjusted to simulate various field conditions, creating pools of shadow and brightness that would challenge visual adaptation and tactical awareness. Colonel James Patterson stood at the center of the space, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every soldier who entered. At 53, he possessed the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of operational experience in environments where mistakes were measured in casualties rather than poor performance evaluations. His uniform bore the subtle indicators of someone who had earned his position through field service rather than administrative advancement, and his manner suggested comfort with authority that came from proven leadership under pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson announced as the various training groups assembled in the larger space, "your morning exercises have been preliminary assessments designed to establish baseline capabilities and identify areas requiring focused attention. This afternoon's activities will transition from evaluation to demonstration, from theory to application under conditions that more closely approximate operational reality." The shift in terminology was subtle but significant. Exercises had become activities, assessments had become demonstrations, and training had moved toward operations. The language suggested that whatever followed would carry consequences beyond academic evaluation, though the specific nature of those consequences remained deliberately unclear. Group C had completed their rotation through 4 different stations, each designed to test distinct aspects of combat readiness. Lenny's performance had been consistently exceptional, her approach to each scenario revealing depths of knowledge and capability that surprised instructors familiar with evaluating elite soldiers. Her threat assessment skills, in particular, had demonstrated the kind of precision that suggested formal training beyond standard military curricula. "Your individual performances this morning," Patterson continued, "have been documented and analyzed. Some of you have exceeded expectations in ways that suggest readiness for advanced responsibilities. Others have revealed limitations that require immediate attention if you are to complete this training cycle successfully. A few have demonstrated capabilities that were not apparent during your initial selection process." The colonel's gaze swept the assembled soldiers, pausing briefly on specific individuals whose morning performance had distinguished them from their peers. When his attention settled on Lenny, the pause was barely perceptible, but somehow weighted with significance. The moment passed quickly, but several nearby soldiers noticed the interaction and filed it away for future consideration. "This afternoon's demonstration," Patterson explained, "will involve live scenarios based on actual intelligence regarding enemy personnel you may encounter during operational deployments. The individual you observed in this morning's briefings has been confirmed as present in this sector, and his neutralization has become a priority objective for this training cycle." The announcement sent a ripple of tension through the assembled soldiers. What had appeared to be routine training exercises were revealing themselves as preparation for actual missions with real-world consequences. The photographs and briefings that had seemed like academic materials were intelligence products related to active operational requirements. Staff Sergeant Chun stepped forward, carrying additional materials that expanded on the morning's intelligence briefing. The new photographs were clearer, showing the enemy commander in various settings that revealed more details about his operational methods and tactical preferences. His size was even more imposing in the clearer images, his height and mass suggesting physical capabilities that would challenge conventional approaches to close-quarters combat. Viktor Kozlov, Chun announced, using the enemy commander's name for the first time. Former Spetsnaz operator, current leader of a mercenary unit operating in sectors where our forces maintain active presence. 6 feet 5 inches, approximately. 290 pounds, trained in Systema and Sambo combat techniques. His operational record includes 17 confirmed kills in hand-to-hand combat situations. The statistics were delivered with clinical precision, but their implications sent a chill through the training facility. Kozlov was not a theoretical opponent, but an active threat whose capabilities had been documented through battlefield experience. The soldiers who might face him would need every advantage that training and preparation could provide. His tactical approach, Chun continued, relies on psychological intimidation supported by overwhelming physical force. He seeks to dominate opponents through fear before physical confrontation becomes necessary. When combat does occur, he uses his size and strength to control engagement distances and dictate the terms of confrontation. The briefing included video footage captured from various sources, showing Kozlov in action during previous encounters. The images were grainy and partially obscured, but they revealed someone whose movements combined unusual size with surprising fluidity. His combat style emphasized crushing force applied with tactical intelligence, making him dangerous to opponents who relied on either pure technique or simple aggression. Lenny studied the footage with the same methodical attention she had brought to other aspects of the training, but her analysis went beyond surface observation. She recognized patterns in Kozlov's movement that suggested specific training backgrounds and identified habits that might create opportunities for prepared opponents. More importantly, she saw in his approach the kind of overconfidence that came from rarely encountering effective resistance. "The scenario you will face this afternoon," Patterson announced, "involves neutralizing Kozlov in a controlled environment that simulates the conditions where such an encounter might occur. One volunteer will be selected to demonstrate the application of techniques learned during this training cycle. Success will confirm readiness for operational assignment. Failure will indicate need for additional preparation." The request for volunteers created immediate tension among the assembled soldiers. Facing a simulated opponent based on Kozlov's capabilities would be challenging enough, but the implications of success or failure for future assignments added pressure that transformed the demonstration from academic exercise to career-defining moment. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, weighing opportunity against risk. Hendrik stepped forward without hesitation, his confidence undimmed by the morning's training revelations. "I volunteer, sir. I've been preparing for exactly this kind of challenge, and I'm ready to demonstrate what proper training and physical preparation can accomplish." His announcement drew nods of approval from soldiers who shared his assessment of the situation. Hendricks possessed the kind of obvious physical advantages that seemed well suited to confronting an opponent like Kozlov. His size, strength, and aggressive approach to combat scenarios suggested he might be capable of matching force with force in ways that smaller or more technically oriented soldiers could not. "Your enthusiasm is noted, Sergeant Hendricks," Patterson replied, "but the selection of volunteers will be based on this morning's performance evaluations rather than simple willingness to participate. The soldier chosen for this demonstration must possess specific capabilities that our analysis suggests will be most effective against this particular opponent." The rejection was delivered diplomatically but firmly, leaving Hendricks with no graceful way to press his case. His confidence faltered slightly as he realized that his self-assessment might not align with the instructor's evaluation of his capabilities. The moment provided a subtle but important lesson about the difference between perceived and actual readiness. Patterson consulted his clipboard, reviewing notes that had been compiled throughout the morning's training sessions. The selection process had obviously been predetermined, based on careful analysis of each soldier's performance across multiple scenarios. When he looked up, his attention focused directly on Lenny with the kind of certainty that suggested no other choice had been seriously considered. "Crawford," he announced, "you will demonstrate neutralization techniques against our simulated opponent. Your performance this morning across multiple scenarios indicates tactical understanding and technical capability that may prove effective against unconventional challenges." The announcement created immediate shock among soldiers who had witnessed the morning's social dynamics. The idea that Lenny, who had been dismissed and mocked for her size and apparent limitations, would be selected for the most challenging demonstration of the training cycle seemed to contradict everything they thought they understood about combat effectiveness and military hierarchy. Hendricks' reaction was immediate and vocal. "Sir, with all due respect, I think there may be some mistakes in the evaluation process. Crawford has shown no indication of the kind of aggressive capability required for this type of confrontation. Perhaps a review of the morning's assessments might reveal more suitable candidates." His challenge to the selection was carefully worded to avoid direct insubordination while making clear his disagreement with the decision. Several other soldiers nodded in support of his position, their expressions reflecting shared confusion about the choice of volunteer. The social dynamics that had developed during breakfast were reasserting themselves in the face of official decisions that seemed to contradict obvious realities. Patterson's response was measured but carried unmistakable authority. "Sergeant Hendricks, the evaluation process takes into account factors that may not be apparent to casual observation. Combat effectiveness involves considerably more than physical size or apparent aggressiveness. Technical skill, tactical intelligence, and psychological preparation often prove more decisive than obvious physical advantages." The rebuke was gentle but clear, serving both to support the selection decision and to educate soldiers whose understanding of combat effectiveness was based on incomplete assumptions. The colonel's experience with operational realities informed his assessment in ways that training scenarios could only approximate. Lenny stepped forward to accept the assignment, her expression calm and focused despite the controversy surrounding her selection. The transition from dismissed outsider to chosen demonstrator had occurred with startling speed, but she showed no signs of surprise or uncertainty about her new role. Her demeanor suggested that she had been preparing for exactly this type of opportunity. "Thank you, sir," she said simply, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had characterized her performance throughout the morning's training. "I'm ready to proceed whenever you determine the conditions are appropriate." The response was professionally perfect, acknowledging the assignment without displaying either false modesty or overconfidence. Her manner suggested familiarity with high-pressure situations and comfort with responsibilities that others might find overwhelming. The transformation from invisible trainee to central focus of attention appeared to require no psychological adjustment on her part. Chun began explaining the parameters of the demonstration, describing the simulated environment where the encounter would take place and the specific objectives that would define success or failure. The scenario was designed to replicate conditions where Kozlov might be encountered during actual operations, complete with environmental challenges and tactical complications that would test improvisation as well as technical skill. The demonstrator will enter the scenario with standard equipment and no advanced knowledge of the opponent's specific location or tactical approach, Chun announced. Success will be measured by neutralization of the threat while maintaining personal safety and operational security. Failure will result in simulated casualties that would compromise mission objectives. The stakes were clearly defined, though the specific consequences of failure remained diplomatically vague. Every soldier understood that performance during this demonstration would influence future assignments and career trajectories in ways that extended far beyond the immediate training cycle. The pressure was real, even if the combat itself would be carefully controlled. As preparations began for the afternoon demonstration, the social dynamics among the training group underwent rapid realignment. Soldiers who had dismissed Lenny, based on surface observations, were forced to reconsider their assessments in light of official recognition of her capabilities. The hierarchy that had seemed established during breakfast was revealing itself to be based on incomplete information and flawed assumptions. Hendricks found himself in the particularly uncomfortable position of having his judgment publicly contradicted by superior officers whose evaluation carried considerably more weight than his personal opinions. His confidence in his own assessment abilities had been shaken by the discovery that qualities he considered most important were apparently less decisive than factors he had failed to recognize. The afternoon's demonstration would provide definitive answers to questions that had been developing throughout the training cycle. Capabilities that had been hidden would be revealed, assumptions would be tested against reality, and the true measure of combat effectiveness would be determined through direct application rather than theoretical discussion. Lenny prepared for the challenge with the same methodical approach she brought to every task, reviewing technical details and tactical considerations while maintaining the internal calm that had characterized her performance throughout the morning. The mockery she had endured was about to be answered not through words or arguments but through demonstration of capabilities that would speak for themselves. The training facility buzzed with anticipation as final preparations were completed. The afternoon's demonstration would determine more than individual advancement. It would establish principles about combat effectiveness that would influence how future training cycles approach the development of elite soldiers. The outcome would resonate far beyond the immediate participants, shaping institutional understanding of what truly mattered when violence became the final arbiter of success or failure. The moment of recognition had arrived, transforming assumptions into tests and theories into reality. The demonstration arena had been transformed into a meticulously crafted simulation of urban combat conditions. Modular walls created narrow corridors and intersecting passages that mimicked the claustrophobic environment of city fighting, where sightlines were limited and threats could emerge from any direction. The lighting had been adjusted to create sharp contrasts between illuminated areas and deep shadows, forcing participants to rely on movement and sound as much as visual cues. Emergency medical personnel positioned themselves at strategic locations around the perimeter, their presence a sobering reminder that despite careful controls, the demonstration would involve real physical contact between highly trained combatants. Portable monitoring equipment tracked vital signs and movement patterns, while high-speed cameras captured every angle of the encounter for subsequent analysis and instruction. The assembled soldiers created a semicircle around the arena's perimeter, their faces reflecting mixtures of anticipation, skepticism, and professional curiosity. The morning's social dynamics had been disrupted by the selection of Lenny as the demonstration volunteer, creating uncertainty about assumptions that had seemed reliable only hours before. Conversations were subdued and speculative, soldiers trying to reconcile their expectations with the reality of official evaluation. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped into the arena's center, her voice carrying clearly across the space as she explained the demonstration's specific parameters. The scenario simulates an encounter with a high-value target in contested urban territory. The volunteer will enter with standard equipment and must locate, engage, and neutralize the threat while maintaining operational security and personal safety. The rules of engagement were carefully defined to ensure both safety and realism. Physical contact would be controlled but genuine, requiring participants to demonstrate actual technique rather than choreographed movements. Medical supervision would intervene if injuries appeared likely, but the goal was to allow combat skills to be tested under conditions that approximated real-world pressure. Lenny stood quietly near the arena's entrance, her equipment checked and rechecked according to standard protocols. She wore the same training uniform as every other soldier, carried the same basic gear, and showed none of the specialized preparation that might be expected for such a challenging demonstration. Her demeanor remained calm and focused, displaying neither overconfidence nor visible anxiety about the task ahead. The arena's far entrance opened to admit the individual who would portray Viktor Kozlov during the demonstration. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb emerged from the shadows like a force of nature given human form. At 6 feet 6 inches and 310 pounds, he possessed even more imposing physical presence than the actual enemy commander. His movements combined fluid grace with overwhelming mass, creating the psychological impact that Kozlov used to dominate opponents. Before physical confrontation began, Webb had been selected for this role through careful analysis of both physical attributes and combat capabilities. His background included extensive training in Russian combat systems, making him uniquely qualified to replicate Kozlov's fighting style and tactical approach. More importantly, his personality allowed him to project the kind of controlled menace that made Kozlov such an effective psychological weapon. The sight of Webb in full character drew audible reactions from the assembled soldiers. His size was genuinely intimidating, suggesting physical capabilities that would challenge even the most capable opponents. Several soldiers glanced toward Lenny with expressions that mixed concern with incredulity, unable to reconcile the obvious disparity in physical attributes with the official confidence in her selection. Hendrik shook his head slightly, his expression reflecting continued disbelief at the situation's development. "This is insane," he muttered to Morrison, loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear. "They're going to get her killed for the sake of some point about political correctness. Webb could break her in half without even trying." His commentary reflected shared concerns among soldiers whose understanding of combat effectiveness was based primarily on obvious physical advantages. The visual contrast between Lenny and Webb seemed to confirm every assumption about size, strength, and fighting capability that conventional wisdom supported. Colonel Patterson positioned himself where he could observe both the demonstration and the reactions of the assembled soldiers. His evaluation would encompass not just the technical execution of combat techniques, but the broader lessons about leadership, tactical thinking, and institutional assumptions that the encounter would reveal. The demonstration served multiple purposes beyond simple skills assessment. "Participants will enter from opposite ends of the arena," Rodriguez announced. "The encounter will begin when visual contact is established. Medical intervention will occur only if serious injury appears imminent. The demonstration concludes when one participant achieves decisive tactical advantage or when safety considerations require termination." The parameters were deliberately broad, allowing the encounter to develop according to the participants' capabilities and tactical choices rather than rigid choreography. This approach would provide more valuable assessment information, but also created additional unpredictability that increased both risk and instructional value. Lenny entered the arena from the designated position, moving with the same measured pace that characterized all her actions. The simulated urban environment immediately imposed its own challenges, requiring constant awareness of potential ambush positions and tactical opportunities. Her movement patterns revealed familiarity with urban combat principles that went beyond standard military training. Webb entered from the opposite end, his presence immediately dominating the space despite the arena's size. His movements were deliberately loud and aggressive, designed to create psychological pressure and announce his location to any potential opponent. The approach replicated Kozlov's tactical preference for intimidation over stealth, using fear as a weapon to weaken enemies before physical contact occurred. The initial phase of the encounter involved navigation through the simulated urban terrain, each participant seeking tactical advantage while avoiding premature exposure to their opponent. The arena's design forced movement through predictable choke points where encounters would be unavoidable, but the timing and circumstances of those encounters remained subject to individual tactical choices. Lenny's approach to terrain navigation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of urban combat principles. She moved with economy and precision, using available cover effectively while maintaining awareness of potential threat directions. Her route selection revealed tactical thinking that prioritized flexibility over speed, keeping multiple options available rather than committing to linear advancement. Webb's movement through the arena created a psychological presence that seemed to fill spaces larger than his actual physical footprint. His tactical approach relied on controlling key terrain features and forcing his opponent into positions where his physical advantages would be decisive. The strategy was sound for someone with his capabilities, but it also created patterns that observant opponents might exploit. The first visual contact occurred at an intersection where three corridors converged, creating the kind of tactical complexity that characterized urban combat. Both participants paused momentarily upon seeing each other, each assessing the situation and considering their options. The moment stretched with tension as psychological and tactical calculations balanced against physical realities. Webb smiled, the expression carrying unmistakable menace, as he recognized the apparent mismatch between his capabilities and those of his opponent. "Little girl," he called out, his voice echoing through the arena with deliberate psychological impact. "You should have stayed home where it's safe. This is no place for someone who belongs in an office." The taunt was calculated to create an emotional reaction that might compromise tactical judgment, a technique that Kozlov employed effectively against opponents who allowed personal feelings to override professional training. The assembled soldiers tensed at the verbal provocation, recognizing its tactical purpose while wondering how Lenny would respond. Lenny's response was silence. Her expression remained calm and focused despite the psychological pressure. She continued her tactical assessment of the situation, analyzing terrain features and tactical options without visible reaction to Webb's attempt at intimidation. Her behavior demonstrated the kind of emotional control that separated professional soldiers from those who relied primarily on aggression. The physical encounter began when Webb moved to close the distance between them, his approach designed to use his size and strength to overwhelm his opponent before technical skill could become a factor. His movement was smooth and controlled, displaying the fluid power that made him such an effective simulation of Kozlov's capabilities. Lenny's response shattered every assumption about combat effectiveness that the morning's social dynamics had established. Instead of retreating or attempting to match force with force, she moved toward Webb with explosive precision that transformed the engagement from a contest of strength into a demonstration of tactical superiority. Her initial movement took her inside Webb's reach before he could fully deploy his physical advantages, a tactical decision that required split-second timing and absolute confidence in her technical capabilities. The maneuver demonstrated an understanding of leverage and anatomical vulnerability that went far beyond standard military combatives training. The first contact point was Webb's lead wrist, which Lenny secured with a grip that combined mechanical precision with anatomical knowledge. The control she established was subtle but absolute, redirecting his forward momentum while simultaneously compromising his balance and limiting his offensive options. The technique was executed with such fluid efficiency that its complexity was not immediately apparent to casual observers. Webb's attempt to counter the initial control revealed the depth of Lenny's tactical preparation. Every adjustment he made was anticipated and countered. His superior size and strength neutralized by positioning that prevented him from bringing those advantages to bear effectively. The engagement became a masterclass in the application of leverage and timing against raw physical power. The assembled soldiers watched in stunned silence as their assumptions about combat effectiveness were systematically demolished. Lenny's movement patterns revealed training that went far beyond standard military curricula, displaying mastery of principles that some of them had never encountered despite years of professional development. Her control of the engagement was absolute but appeared effortless, each technique flowing naturally into the next without visible strain or hesitation. Webb's increasingly desperate attempts to reassert dominance only served to demonstrate the completeness of his tactical disadvantage. Size and strength, which had seemed decisive only moments before, proved irrelevant when properly countered. By superior technique and positioning, the climax of the demonstration came when Lenny transitioned from defensive control to offensive termination with a movement sequence that was almost too fast for the human eye to follow completely. Webb found himself airborne and then on the ground with such sudden finality that the transition seemed to violate the laws of physics as much as combat expectations. The technique she employed was a perfect fusion of leverage, timing, and anatomical knowledge that rendered Webb's physical advantages not just irrelevant, but actually counterproductive. His size and momentum became weapons turned against him, amplifying the force of techniques that a smaller opponent could never have generated. Through simple strength, Webb struck the arena floor with impact that echoed through the space like thunder, the sound emphasizing the definitiveness of his defeat. He lay motionless for several seconds, not from injury but from the psychological shock of discovering that his fundamental assumptions about combat had been completely wrong. Medical personnel moved forward to assess both participants, but their intervention proved unnecessary. Lenny had controlled every aspect of the engagement with such precision that no injury had occurred despite the dramatic nature of the encounter's conclusion. Her technical execution had been flawless, demonstrating mastery that impressed even the most experienced instructors. The silence that followed the demonstration was profound, filled with the weight of assumptions destroyed and paradigms shifted. Soldiers who had mocked Lenny's capabilities only hours before now faced the reality that their understanding of combat effectiveness had been fundamentally flawed. The hierarchy that had seemed so obvious during breakfast was revealed as based on illusion rather than substance. Colonel Patterson stepped into the arena, his expression reflecting satisfaction with the demonstration's outcome and its instructional value. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "you have just witnessed a perfect example of why we evaluate soldiers based on demonstrated capability rather than surface appearance. Technical skill, tactical intelligence, and psychological preparation will always prove superior to simple physical attributes when properly applied." The lesson was clear, but its implications extended far beyond combat techniques. The demonstration had revealed how institutional biases and social assumptions could blind even experienced soldiers to capabilities that existed outside conventional expectations. The morning's mockery now appeared not just cruel but professionally incompetent. Lenny helped Webb to his feet, her manner professional and respectful, despite the completeness of her victory. The gesture demonstrated the kind of character that military institutions valued as much as technical competence, showing that true strength included the wisdom to use power appropriately rather than seeking domination for its own sake. As the demonstration concluded and normal training activities resumed, the social dynamics among the assembled soldiers had been fundamentally altered. Respect had been earned not through words or arguments, but through undeniable demonstration of capabilities that spoke for themselves. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as unsuitable for elite training had proven herself the most capable soldier in the entire group. The medical assessment station occupied a corner of the training facility, where portable equipment and folding chairs created a temporary clinic atmosphere. Webb sat on the examination table while a medic checked his reflexes and asked routine questions about dizziness or pain. His responses were mechanical, delivered in the flat tone of someone whose world had been fundamentally reorganized in the space of 60 seconds. "No concussion indicators," the medic reported to Colonel Patterson, who had positioned himself where he could observe both the medical evaluation and the broader reactions among the assembled soldiers. "Some bruising across the shoulder and back area, but nothing that suggests serious trauma. He's cleared for normal activities." The medical clearance was routine but symbolically important, confirming that Lenny's demonstration had been controlled with surgical precision despite its dramatic impact. Her ability to neutralize such a formidable opponent without causing injury spoke to technical mastery that went beyond simple combat effectiveness into the realm of tactical artistry. Webb nodded his acknowledgement of the medical clearance, but remained seated, his massive frame somehow appearing smaller than it had before the demonstration. The psychological impact of the encounter had proven more significant than any physical damage, forcing him to confront the limitations of assumptions he had carried throughout his military career. "I've been training combatives for 8 years, he said quietly to the medic, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment that was audible to nearby personnel. "I thought I understood what effective technique looked like, what she did. I've never seen anything like it. It was like fighting against physics itself." The comment reflected a reality that several other soldiers were beginning to acknowledge. Lenny's performance had transcended the boundaries of conventional military training, demonstrating capabilities that suggested formal instruction in disciplines rarely encountered within standard institutional frameworks. Her techniques had been familiar enough to recognize as legitimate, but exotic enough to seem almost supernatural in their effectiveness. Across the facility, the normal rhythm of training activities had resumed, but the underlying dynamics had been irrevocably altered. Conversations that had flowed easily during the mornings, breakfast now carried undercurrents of uncertainty and reassessment. Soldiers found themselves questioning judgments that had seemed obvious only hours before, forced to reconsider not just their evaluation of Lenny, but their understanding of combat effectiveness itself. Hendrick stood with Morrison and Watson near the equipment racks, their discussion animated but conducted in lowered voices that suggested sensitivity about being overheard. The confident assertions that had characterized their morning commentary had been replaced by defensive explanations and attempts to rationalize what they had witnessed. "It doesn't change the fundamental realities," Hendricks insisted, though his tone lacked the conviction that had marked his earlier pronouncements. "She got lucky with one technique against one opponent in a controlled environment. Real combat is different. Real combat involves variables that can't be predicted or prepared for." Morrison nodded agreement, but his expression suggested uncertainty about the argument's validity. "Maybe, but did you see how she moved? That wasn't luck, Marcus. That was like watching a master class in something we've never been taught. Where the hell did she learn to fight like that?" The question hung in the air without answer, highlighting one of the most disturbing aspects of the demonstration's aftermath. Lenny's capabilities had been revealed without explanation, leaving observers to speculate about training backgrounds and experience levels that fell outside conventional understanding. Her personnel file contained nothing that would predict such extraordinary performance. Watson, always eager to contribute to discussions among his more experienced peers, offered his own analysis. "Maybe they brought her here specifically for this demonstration, like a ringer or something. Maybe the whole thing was set up to make some kind of point about underestimating people." The suggestion drew consideration from the others, representing an attempt to find rational explanations for what had appeared to defy rational analysis. The possibility that Lenny's selection had been based on hidden knowledge about her capabilities offered psychological comfort to soldiers whose professional confidence had been shaken by the morning's events. Sergeant Barnes approached their group, her expression reflecting the same mixture of confusion and defensive rationalization that characterized most post-demonstration discussions. As one of the few women in the training cycle, she faced particular pressure to respond appropriately to Lenny's performance without appearing to compromise her own carefully constructed position within the unit's social hierarchy. "I have to admit," Barnes said carefully, "that was impressive from a technical standpoint. But I still think there are questions about how that kind of performance translates to real operational conditions. Training demonstrations and actual combat involve completely different psychological pressures." Her comment reflected genuine uncertainty about the implications of what she had witnessed. Barnes had built her military career on the principle that women could succeed in combat roles by meeting the same standards as their male counterparts. But Lenny's performance suggested capabilities that transcended conventional gender-based analysis entirely. Lieutenant Cross observed these conversations from his position near the facility's administrative area, where he was reviewing training records and preparing evaluation reports that would influence future assignment decisions. The morning's demonstration had created documentation challenges that went beyond simple performance assessment, requiring explanations for capabilities that exceeded institutional expectations. "Sir," Sergeant Rodriguez approached Cross with a tablet containing preliminary analysis of the demonstration footage. "The technical review team has completed their initial assessment. They're requesting guidance on classification protocols for the techniques that were demonstrated." The request highlighted bureaucratic complications that arose when exceptional performance exceeded existing categorization systems. Military institutions operated on standardized frameworks for evaluating and documenting soldier capabilities, but Lenny's demonstration had revealed skills that fell outside those established parameters. Cross reviewed the preliminary analysis, noting technical observations that confirmed what every witness had seen but struggled to explain. "Recommend we classify this as specialized individual training requiring further assessment," he decided. "Flag it for advanced instruction consideration, but don't specify details that might compromise operational security." The decision reflected institutional pragmatism about managing exceptional capabilities within standardized systems. Lenny's performance would be documented and recognized, but in ways that maintained operational security while avoiding disruptive questions about training programs that might not officially exist. Meanwhile, Lenny herself had withdrawn to a quiet corner of the facility where she conducted her own post-demonstration assessment with the same methodical attention she brought to every task. Her notebook lay open on a small table, its pages covered with technical observations and tactical notes that would inform future preparation and training. Her evaluation of the encounter focused on technical execution rather than emotional impact, analyzing moments where her performance could have been more efficient and identifying areas where additional preparation might prove valuable. The demonstration had been successful, but professional development required honest assessment of both strengths and limitations. "Mind if I join you?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Chun, who had approached with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of respectful distance that acknowledged both professional boundaries and genuine curiosity about capabilities he had witnessed but not fully understood. Lenny looked up from her notes and nodded toward an empty chair. "Of course, Sergeant. I was just reviewing the technical aspects of the demonstration to identify areas for improvement." Shun settled into the chair and placed 1 coffee cup within her reach, his manner suggesting professional interest rather than casual social interaction. "I've been training combatives for 12 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything quite like what you demonstrated today. Would you mind sharing some insight into your background and training?" The question was carefully phrased to request information without demanding it, acknowledging that some aspects of military training remained classified or restricted to specific personnel. Shun's genuine professional curiosity was evident, But he clearly understood the boundaries that might limit how much Lenny could or would reveal about her capabilities. "My father was a career military," Lenny replied, choosing her words carefully, "to provide context without compromising operational security. He believed that size and strength were less important than understanding leverage and anatomical vulnerability. I've been studying those principles since I was old enough to understand them." The explanation was truthful but incomplete, providing enough background to satisfy curiosity without revealing details that might compromise future operational effectiveness. Her approach to personal disclosure reflected the same tactical intelligence that had characterized her combat performance. Shun nodded thoughtfully, recognizing both the value and the limitations of the information she had provided. "Your demonstration today will have a lasting impact on how this institution approaches combat training and soldier evaluation. You've challenged assumptions that most of us didn't even realize we were making." The observation carried weight beyond simple professional compliment, acknowledging the broader implications of the morning's events. Lenny's performance had created educational opportunities that would influence institutional approaches to training and development for years to come. "That wasn't my intention," Lenny replied simply. "I was just trying to complete the assigned task using the most effective methods available. The broader implications weren't really part of my tactical calculations." Her response reflected the professional focus that had characterized her approach throughout the training cycle. Lenny's primary concern was operational effectiveness rather than social impact, though she clearly understood that exceptional performance inevitably carried consequences beyond immediate tactical objectives. As afternoon activities continued, the ripple effects of the demonstration spread throughout the training facility. Conversations that had begun with attempts to rationalize or dismiss what had occurred gradually evolved into more substantive discussions about combat effectiveness, technical training, and institutional assumptions about physical capabilities. Several soldiers approached instructors with questions about advanced training opportunities and specialized techniques that might improve their own performance. The demonstration had served as a catalyst for broader interest in capabilities beyond conventional military curricula, creating demand for educational resources that many had not previously considered relevant. Colonel Patterson convened a brief meeting with senior instructors to discuss immediate and long-term implications of the morning's events. The session focused on curricular adjustments that might be needed to address the gaps in understanding that the demonstration had revealed, as well as evaluation protocols that could better identify exceptional capabilities among future training candidates. Today's demonstration confirmed that our current assessment methods may be overlooking significant capabilities, Patterson observed. "We need to develop evaluation approaches that go beyond conventional assumptions about physical attributes and combat effectiveness." The institutional response reflected professional recognition that exceptional performance required institutional adaptation. Military organizations that failed to recognize and develop extraordinary capabilities risked losing competitive advantages that could prove decisive in operational environments. As evening approached and normal training schedules drew to a close, the social dynamics among the assembled soldiers had stabilized around new realities that acknowledged capabilities previously hidden. Respect had been earned through demonstration rather than assertion, creating hierarchies based on demonstrated competence rather than assumed attributes. Lenny prepared for the evening meal with the same methodical approach she brought to every activity, organizing her equipment and reviewing the day's lessons while maintaining the internal calm that had characterized her performance throughout the training cycle. The morning's mockery had been answered definitively, but her focus remained on professional development rather than personal vindication. The mess hall would present new social challenges as soldiers processed the day's revelations and adjusted their interactions accordingly. But those challenges would be met with the same tactical intelligence and emotional discipline that had proven so effective during the mornings. Demonstration. The quiet resolution of the day's conflicts had established new foundations for future interactions, based on demonstrated realities rather than surface assumptions. Strength had been revealed where it had been hidden, and wisdom had been recognized where it had been dismissed. The mountain air outside carried the evening's coolness, promising respite from the day's intensity and offering opportunities for reflection on lessons learned through direct experience rather than academic instruction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would be met by soldiers who had learned to look beyond obvious appearances to recognize capabilities that might otherwise remain hidden. 3 weeks after the demonstration that had redefined every assumption about combat effectiveness at Camp Redstone, the mountain air carried the first hints of autumn. Pine needles rustled with a different quality in the morning breeze, and the light had taken on the crystalline clarity that came with changing seasons. The training cycle was nearing its conclusion, and the soldiers who would graduate had been transformed by experiences that went far beyond technical instruction. Lenny walked the same mountain trail that had begun her journey at Camp Redstone. But the woman who moved along the rocky path was different from the one who had arrived a month before. Not in any obvious way her stride remained the same measured pace. Her equipment was organized with identical precision, and her expression carried the same calm focus that had characterized her from the beginning. The difference lay in the space around her, in the way the world had reorganized itself to acknowledge capabilities that had always existed, but were now finally recognized. The morning reconnaissance that had been a solitary ritual during her first weeks at the facility now served a different purpose. She was no longer preparing to prove herself to instructors and peers who questioned her belonging. Instead, she was preparing to leave, to carry forward lessons learned in mountains to operational environments where the stakes would be measured in lives rather than training evaluations. Her canvas bag contained the same modest collection of personal items it had held on that first morning, but the context surrounding those items had been fundamentally altered. The cedar token still rested in its familiar corner, worn smooth by years of handling and carrying with it memories of home and purpose. But now it also carried the weight of achievement, of challenges met and obstacles overcome through discipline. Rather than accident. The trail descended toward Camp Redstone through the same switchbacks and stone outcroppings that had marked her daily ascent, but the facility that came into view below had been transformed by experience and perspective. The geometric patterns of buildings and training areas remained unchanged, but they now represented something different, not a place where she had been tested and found wanting, but a place where exceptional capabilities had been revealed and properly valued. The morning's graduation ceremony would mark the official conclusion of the training cycle, but the real conclusion had occurred weeks before, when assumptions were shattered and new understanding emerged from the wreckage of old certainties. What remained was the formal acknowledgement of lessons learned and the transition from preparation to application. Lenny paused at the boulder where she had stopped countless times before, using the moment to complete her final assessment of terrain that had become as familiar as home. The tactical knowledge she had gained here would serve her well in future operations, but the personal growth that had occurred would prove even more valuable. She had learned not just how to fight more effectively, but how to navigate institutional dynamics that could either support or undermine mission success. The guard post at the camp entrance was manned by soldiers she now recognized as individuals, rather than anonymous functionaries. Their acknowledgement of her passage carried respect that had been earned rather than assumed, creating interactions based on demonstrated capability rather than surface assumptions. The transformation was subtle but meaningful, reflecting broader changes in how the institution approached soldier evaluation and development. Inside the perimeter, the final preparations for graduation were evident in the increased activity around administrative buildings and the presence of senior officers whose attendance would formalize the training cycle's completion. The ceremony itself would be brief and professional, focused on recognizing achievement rather than celebrating personalities, but its significance extended far beyond the immediate participants. Master Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from the training facility carrying folders that contained final evaluations and assignment recommendations for each graduating soldier. Her expression reflected satisfaction with the cycle's outcomes, but also awareness that exceptional performance had created opportunities and challenges that would require continued institutional adaptation. "Crawford," she called as Lenny approached, "Colonel Patterson wants to see you before the ceremony. Something about advanced assignment options that require immediate consideration." The summons was expected but still carried weight beyond routine. Administrative requirements. Lenny's performance had attracted attention from organizational levels far above Camp Redstone, creating opportunities for specialized assignments that would utilize capabilities revealed during the training cycle. The discussion would determine not just her immediate future, but the direction of her entire military career. Colonel Patterson's temporary office occupied a corner of the administrative building where portable furniture and communication equipment created a workspace that was functional without being permanent. Maps covered one wall, marked with operational areas where graduates might be deployed, while another wall displayed photographs of successful training cycles spanning several years. "Take a seat, Crawford," Patterson said as she entered, his manner professional but warmer than the formal interactions that had characterized their earlier meetings. "I wanted to discuss your performance this cycle and some opportunities that have become available as a result of your demonstrated capabilities." Lenny settled into the offered chair, her posture alert but relaxed, ready to receive information that would shape her future service. The conversation would determine whether her exceptional performance led to specialized assignments or simply returned her to conventional units where her capabilities might be underutilized. "Your technical demonstration 3 weeks ago," Patterson continued, "has generated considerable interest among organizations that require precisely the kinds of capabilities you displayed. There are assignment options available that would allow you to apply those skills in operational environments where they could make significant strategic impact." The opportunities he described involved specialized units that operated in environments where conventional military approaches proved inadequate. These assignments would require not just technical combat skills, but the kind of tactical intelligence and psychological discipline that Lenny had demonstrated throughout her training. The work would be challenging and potentially dangerous, but it would also provide opportunities to make meaningful contributions to national security objectives. "The assignments come with certain requirements," Patterson explained. "Additional training in specialized techniques, security clearances that restrict personal communications, and deployment schedules that limit time for conventional social relationships. The work is important, but it requires significant personal sacrifice." Lenny listened carefully to the details, weighing opportunities against obligations and considering how specialized assignment would align with her long-term professional goals. The decision would not be made lightly, but it would be made based on operational effectiveness rather than personal comfort or social considerations. "I understand the requirements, sir," she replied after Patterson had completed his explanation. "The opportunities sound challenging and meaningful. I'd like to accept assignment to whatever organization can make best use of my capabilities." Her response reflected the same professional focus that had characterized her approach throughout the training cycle. Personal considerations were secondary to operational effectiveness, and individual advancement mattered less than contributing to mission success. The decision was consistent with values that had guided her development from childhood through military service. Patterson nodded, having expected her response based on his observation of her character and priorities. "Excellent. The paperwork will be processed immediately, and you'll receive detailed briefings about your new assignment within 48 hours. I should warn you that the work you'll be doing may not receive public recognition, but it will be appreciated by people who understand its importance. The warning was both professional courtesy and practical preparation for assignments, where success was measured by objectives achieved rather than credit received. Lenny's future work would take place in shadows where effectiveness mattered more than visibility, where the most important victories were often those that remained unknown to the broader public. As the meeting concluded and Lenny prepared to rejoin her training group for the graduation ceremony, the broader implications of the morning's conversation were still settling into place. Her exceptional performance had opened doors to opportunities that would challenge her capabilities and allow her to make meaningful contributions to national security. The journey that had begun with mockery and dismissal was culminating in recognition and responsibility. The graduation ceremony itself took place in the facility's main training area, where the 43 soldiers who had completed the cycle stood in formation before assembled instructors and visiting officials. The speeches were brief and focused on professional achievement rather than personal celebration, emphasizing the importance of applying learned skills in service of broader institutional objectives. When her name was called and she stepped forward to receive formal recognition of her exceptional performance, Lenny maintained the same composed demeanor that had characterized her throughout the training cycle. The applause that followed was genuine but restrained, reflecting professional respect rather than social celebration. The moment marked an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of one phase of development and the commencement of another. Staff Sergeant Chun approached her after the ceremony, carrying the notebook she had left behind during final equipment processing. "I thought you might want this," he said, extending the worn volume that contained months of technical observations and tactical notes. "Your insights might prove valuable during future assignments." The gesture was both practical and symbolic, acknowledging that her knowledge had value beyond personal application. The notes she had compiled during training represented intellectual resources that could benefit future soldiers and inform institutional approaches to combat development. Her contribution to the organization would extend beyond individual performance to shared learning that would improve overall effectiveness. Sergeant Barnes also approached, her manner more formal than their previous interactions, but carrying genuine respect that had replaced earlier competitive tension. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "Watching your performance challenged me to reconsider my own assumptions about capability and effectiveness. I'll be a better soldier because of what I learned from your example." The acknowledgement reflected broader recognition that exceptional performance created educational opportunities for everyone who witnessed it. Lenny's demonstration had forced institutional examination of assumptions that had limited understanding of combat effectiveness, creating improvements that would benefit future training cycles and operational assignments. Even Hendricks made an effort to approach her before departure, his manner awkward but sincere as he attempted to address the gap between his initial assessments and subsequent reality. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I let assumptions override observation, and I was wrong about your capabilities. I hope you'll accept that as recognition of my error rather than just professional courtesy." His acknowledgement carried weight precisely because it was difficult, representing genuine growth rather than simply political correctness. The transformation in his understanding reflected broader institutional learning that would influence how future soldiers were evaluated and developed. Personal humility had become professional wisdom through direct experience with exceptional performance. As the afternoon drew to a close and departing soldiers began their journey to new assignments, Lenny completed her own final preparations with the same methodical attention that had characterized her approach throughout the training cycle. Her equipment was organized and ready, her paperwork was complete, and her mind was focused on challenges that lay ahead rather than achievements that lay behind. The mountain air carried the cooling promise of evening as she made one final walk around the facility that had been home for a month. The buildings and training areas remained unchanged, but her relationship to them had been fundamentally transformed. She was no longer the underestimated soldier who had arrived seeking to prove her worth, but a recognized professional whose capabilities had been demonstrated and valued. The trail that would carry her away from Camp Redstone led not just to new geographic locations, but to operational environments where the lessons learned in the mountains would be applied to challenges with real-world consequences. The mockery that had greeted her arrival had been replaced by respect earned through performance, but more importantly, the assumptions that had limited institutional understanding had been replaced by recognition of capabilities that transcended conventional boundaries. The cedar token in her canvas bag caught the last light of day as she adjusted the familiar weight across her shoulder. It carried with it memories of home and purpose, but also the knowledge that strength came in many forms and was often found in unexpected places. The woman who walked away from Camp Redstone was the same person who had arrived, but the world's understanding of her capabilities had been forever changed. Behind her, the facility settled into the rhythm of preparing for new training cycles and fresh challenges. The lessons learned during her time there would influence how future soldiers were evaluated and developed, creating improvements that would benefit countless individuals whose own capabilities might otherwise remain hidden. Her legacy would live not in recognition or publicity, but in the institutional wisdom that exceptional performance could emerge from unexpected sources. The mountain trail stretched ahead, leading toward assignments where technical skill would be combined with tactical intelligence in service of objectives that remained classified, but were undeniably important. The journey that had begun with dismissal and mockery was continuing toward challenges that would test not just individual capabilities, but institutional understanding of what it meant to serve with distinction. The deeper truth had been revealed. Through patient persistence and professional excellence, that strength was not always obvious, that capability often hid behind humble appearances, and that the most important victories were frequently achieved by those who sought no recognition. Beyond the satisfaction of work completed with integrity and skill, the world was safer because of soldiers like Lenny Crawford, even if the world would never know their names or understand the sacrifices they made in service of something greater than themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.